Elvis sat in the back of a piano class for 40 minutes without saying a word. When the teacher finally asked him to demonstrate, she didn't teach another class for 3 days. It was a Tuesday afternoon in the autumn of 1961, and Margaret Holloway had been teaching piano for 22 years. She had begun at 24, fresh from the conservatory in Nashville, where she had spent 4 years acquiring the kind of formal training that she believed, with a conviction that had not softened over 2 decades of practice, was the only legitimate foundation for serious musicianship. She had studied theory, harmony, counterpoint, and performance under instructors who had themselves trained in European traditions that stretched back through generations of rigorous transmission. She believed in the primacy of technique, in the necessity of reading music before playing it, in the disciplined accumulation of foundational skills before any departure into individual expression. She was a good teacher, thorough, patient, exacting, and her students made real progress under her instruction, which was the only metric she considered relevant. Her studio occupied the ground floor of a building on Union Avenue in Memphis, 3 large rooms that smelled of rosin and old wood, and the particular dry warmth of a space that is heated more for the instruments than for the people. She taught in the main room, which held 2 upright pianos positioned facing each other, and 6 chairs arranged in a semicircle for the students who were observing while others played. Her Tuesday afternoon class was her intermediate group, 7 students ranging in age from 16 to their late 20s, all of them serious enough to have passed her entrance assessment, all of them working on repertoire that required genuine technical engagement. She did not accept walk-ins. She did not permit auditing without prior arrangement. She had a policy about this that she had communicated clearly to everyone in her professional circle, because she had learned over 22 years that unannounced visitors to a teaching session disrupted the atmosphere that careful instruction required. The policy was not unkindness. It was professionalism. Elvis Presley arrived at her studio on that Tuesday afternoon because of a wrong turn. This is not a metaphor. He had been looking for a different address on Union Avenue, a recording-related errand that had brought him to that part of the street, and had gotten the numbers transposed, the way you do when you are reading an address from memory, and the memory is slightly approximate. He pushed open the wrong door and found himself in a waiting area outside Margaret Holloway's main teaching room. Through the glass panel in the door, he could see the class in progress, a young woman at one of the upright pianos working through something, Margaret standing beside her with the particular focused stillness of a teacher listening for the specific thing she is waiting to hear. He had been about to leave to check the address again and find the right door, when something in the quality of what he was hearing through the glass made him stop. He stood in the waiting area and listened for a moment. The music coming through the door was not remarkable in itself. It was a student working through a passage, stopping and restarting, the repetitive grinding sound of something being learned. But underneath it, in the corrections and adjustments Margaret was making that reached him as a lower register of sound beneath the piano, there was something that held him. He sat down in one of the chairs and listened further. The errand he had come to Union Avenue for receded in his attention the way things recede when something more interesting has presented itself, and after a few minutes, the receding was complete, and he was simply sitting in a chair outside a piano studio on a Tuesday afternoon, listening to a class through a glass door, in no hurry to be anywhere else. It was Margaret's assistant, a young woman named Claire, who managed the administrative side of the studio, who found him there about 10 minutes in. She came through the front door with an armload of sheet music and stopped when she saw the dark-haired man sitting in the waiting area. She recognized him. She was 22 years old, and recognizing Elvis Presley required no particular effort in 1961, and stood for a moment in the particular suspended state of a person who has encountered something unexpected and is deciding how to respond to it. Elvis smiled at her and said he hoped it was all right if he sat for a bit. He said he had gotten the wrong address and had heard the playing and had found he didn't want to leave yet. Claire said she would need to check with Margaret. She went to the door of the teaching room and opened it quietly and caught Margaret's eye and conveyed, in the wordless efficiency of 2 people who worked closely together, that something unusual had occurred in the waiting area and required a decision. Margaret came to the door, looked through the glass at the man sitting in her waiting area, and recognized him with the slight delay of a person who encounters the famous outside of their expected context. She opened the door and told him he was welcome to observe if he wished, and that the class would continue for another 40 minutes. She said it with the professional courtesy of a woman who was not going to make a scene about an unannounced visitor, but who was also not going to restructure her afternoon around 1. Elvis thanked her and came into the main room and took the chair farthest from the pianos, near the back wall, and sat down with his hands in his lap. He did not speak for the next 40 minutes. He watched. He watched with the quality of attention that Margaret noticed within the first few minutes, and that she found, despite herself, slightly disconcerting, not because it was aggressive or intrusive, but because it was precise. He was not watching the way a curious visitor watches, with the broad, unfocused gaze of someone taking in an interesting scene. He was watching the way a musician watches another musician play, tracking specific things, following the hands, registering the corrections Margaret was making and the responses those corrections produced in her students. He was, she gradually understood, not a civilian in her classroom. He was a practitioner observing another practitioner's work. This recalibration happened slowly, over the course of the 40 minutes, and it changed the quality of her awareness of him without changing what she was doing. She continued the class. She moved through her students, assigning passages, making corrections, explaining principles. She was a professional, and the class was her first obligation. But some part of her attention had acquired a secondary focus that it had not had at the beginning of the afternoon. With about 5 minutes remaining in the session, she did something that she would think about for a long time afterward, examining her own motivations with the honesty that serious people apply to the things they do that surprise them. She stopped the student who was playing, turned to the back of the room, and asked Elvis if he would like to try the passage. She said later that she did not know exactly why she asked. She said there was something in the quality of his attention over the previous 40 minutes that had produced in her a curiosity she had not been able to set aside. The curiosity of a teacher who has been observed by someone and wants to know what that someone actually understands. She said it was a professional impulse as much as anything else. She wanted to find out what she was dealing with. Elvis stood up from the chair at the back of the room and walked to the piano and sat down. He looked at the sheet music on the stand, the passage her student had been working through, a moderately complex piece that sat at the upper edge of intermediate difficulty. He looked at it for a moment with the focused attention of someone reading something carefully, and then he placed his hands on the keys. He played the passage. He played it correctly, which was not surprising. The passage was within the range of a competent intermediate player, and he was clearly not a beginner. But he played it with something that correct did not account for, something that lived in the spaces between the notes and in the weight he gave to certain phrases, and in the way the piece breathed under his hands. He played it the way people play music that they understand from the inside, rather than the outside. Not just executing the notes, but inhabiting the structure, feeling the architecture of it, moving through it the way you move through a space you know well, rather than one you are navigating from a map. Margaret stood beside the piano and listened. When he finished the passage, he did not stop. This was not defiance. There was no challenge in it. He simply continued, moving into what came next in the piece with the natural momentum of someone following the music where it wanted to go, the way a reader turns a page, not because they have decided to, but because stopping would be the unnatural thing. He played for 11 minutes. He played the remainder of the assigned piece, and then moved into something else, something that was not on the stand, that existed only in his hands and wherever it was coming from, inside him. It moved through several places, a gospel-inflected passage that had the weight and momentum of something learned in a church before it was learned anywhere else, then something quieter and more searching, then a return to a theme from the assigned piece but transformed, carried somewhere the original composer had not taken it. The students who had been sitting in the semicircle had gone still sometime in the first 3 minutes. The two who had been preparing their own passages had stopped preparing. Claire, who had come back into the room to begin the end-of-session tidying, stood near the door with a folder of sheet music in her hands and did not move. What the students heard in those 11 minutes was not a display of technical virtuosity, though the technique was unquestionable. It was something harder to name, the experience of hearing music played by someone for whom the instrument was not a medium of communication, but the thing itself, the place where thinking happened, where whatever needed to be worked out got worked out. The difference between that and performance is audible, though most people cannot say how. It has to do with intention, with whether the music is being directed outward, at an audience, or whether it is simply happening, and the audience is present by coincidence. Margaret Holloway stood beside the piano for all 11 minutes. She did not sit down. She did not move to correct or adjust or intervene. She stood and listened with the expression, one of her students described it carefully afterward, of a person who has spent 22 years building a very precise and detailed understanding of something and has just encountered an instance of that thing that exceeds the boundaries of the understanding. Not negating it, not making it wrong. Exceeding it, the way a river exceeds its banks. The banks are still the banks, the shape of the thing is still the shape, but the water is somewhere the banks did not account for. When Elvis finished and lifted his hands from the keys, there was a silence that lasted longer than such. Silences usually last. Then he looked at Margaret and thanked her for allowing him to observe the class and said he hoped he hadn't overstayed. Margaret said something that she later described as the least adequate response she had ever given to anything in her professional life. She said it was no trouble. He left. Margaret canceled her Wednesday class. She told Claire to reschedule, giving no reason, which was itself unusual. She had never in 22 years canceled a class without a specific practical reason she was willing to state. She taught on Thursday, as scheduled, and by all external observation, the class was normal, structured, thorough, professionally executed. But the student who had been with her the longest, a 26-year-old named Robert, who had been studying with her for 4 years and who knew the particular quality of her attention well, said later that something had shifted in how she taught from that week onward. She began, for the first time in 22 years, to spend time at the beginning of each session asking her students to play something of their own choosing before the assigned work began. She said she wanted to hear where they were coming from before she directed where they were going. It was a small change. It was also, Robert said, the best thing she ever did for her students, because what she was actually doing, though she never stated it in these terms, was making room for what they brought with them before she told them what they were missing. She taught for another 19 years after that Tuesday afternoon. She was, by all accounts, a better teacher in those 19 years than she had been in the 22 before them. The students who trained with her in the later period said there was a quality to her instruction that went beyond technique, a willingness to follow the music somewhere the syllabus hadn't planned for, a patience with the thing that lived underneath the notes. She never spoke publicly about that afternoon, but Claire, who stayed as her assistant for another 8 years, said that the sheet music from the passage Elvis had played that Tuesday remained on the piano stand in the main teaching room for the rest of the week, that Margaret had not put it away or replaced it with the next assignment the way she always did at the end of a session, that it had simply stayed there, on the stand, as though the session were not quite finished yet.